The dog stopped dead, ears forward, body rigid, a low whine escaping his throat. The same sound he made 3 years ago, seconds before an IED tore through their convoy in Afghanistan. Karl Novak froze. He hadn't heard that sound since Helmand Province. Now his white German shepherd was pacing in tight circles, pawing at a scorched cellar hatch on 40 acres of burned Colorado mountain land. The land Karl had bought for $800. Land no one else would touch. The previous owner died when his homestead burned to the ground 7 years ago. The fire was ruled an accident, but Ash didn't alert to accidents. He alerted to threats. This wasn't curiosity. This was a detection alert. Karl reached for the rusted handle. What he found in that cellar would expose a murder, a corporate conspiracy, and the names of the men who thought they'd buried the truth forever. They were about to have a problem. But before we open that cellar, you need to understand the man standing above it. Karl Novak didn't believe in fresh starts. After 3 combat tours, a Bronze Star, and a spine that ached every time the weather changed, he had learned something most people never figure out. The past doesn't wash off. It just gets quieter if you find the right place to sit with it. The army taught him how to survive. What they didn't teach him was how to stop. That's what brought him to a half-empty courthouse in San Juan County, Colorado. Not hope, not ambition, just the need for silence that made sense. The high country up here was beautiful and brutal in equal measure. Jagged peaks cut the sky like broken glass. The air was thin enough to punish anyone who wasn't paying attention. Winters could kill a careless man before help ever arrived. Karl liked it that way. Out here, the danger was honest. Ash understood that too. The dog wasn't a pet. He was a partner. They had bled on the same Afghan dirt, breathed the same smoke, and woken up in the same military hospital, not knowing if the other had made it. The dog had a notched ear and a rope of scar tissue across his shoulder. Souvenirs from the same blast that ended both their military careers. When Karl signed his discharge papers, he signed Ash's the same day. They walked out together. They hadn't been apart since. Some bonds don't need explaining. $800. That's what Karl paid at a county tax auction for 40 acres of scorched earth and a half-collapsed homestead. The auctioneer barely looked up when he won the bid. No one else raised a paddle. The property had belonged to a man named Ed Womack, a retired geologist who spent his final years alone on that mountain. 7 years ago, his homestead burned to the ground in the middle of the night. Ed died in the fire. The county ruled it accidental. Faulty wiring, they said. A tragedy, the neighbors whispered. But no one came forward to claim the land. No distant relatives, no former colleagues. The property sat tangled in liens and back taxes, avoided like a grave no one wanted to tend. When Karl asked around town, people got quiet. A clerk at the hardware store shook her head and said she wouldn't set foot up there for any amount of money. The woman at the diner looked at him for a long moment and said, "That land doesn't want people on it." Karl didn't believe in curses. He'd seen enough real evil to know better. Still, driving up that winding mountain road for the first time with Ash in the passenger seat, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was entering someone else's unfinished story. Now I have to ask, would you buy property where the previous owner died under mysterious circumstances? Drop your answer in the comments. Because what Karl found next made him realize this wasn't just abandoned land. It was a crime scene. Karl pried open the cellar hatch and climbed down into the cold dark. The air smelled like ash and damp stone. 7 years of silence sealed beneath the earth. His flashlight cut through the black, revealing soot-stained walls and the skeleton of a collapsed wooden shelf. That's when Ash started whining again from above. Urgent, insistent. Carl swept the debris aside and found it half buried in rubble, a fireproof lockbox, rusted but intact. The seal had held. Whatever was inside had survived the blaze that killed everything above it. He broke the lock with a pry bar and opened the lid. Inside were core samples in labeled tubes, geological surveys covered in handwritten notes, and a leather-bound journal cracked with age. The journal belonged to Ed Womack, and as Carl read by flashlight, the story of this land revealed itself page by page. Ed had discovered something beneath his property. Significant lithium deposits, the kind of rare earth minerals that powered electric vehicles and modern batteries. A mining company called Ridgeline Resources wanted that land. They started with lowball offers. When Ed refused, they moved to threats. The journal documented years of pressure, falsified tax liens designed to force him out, and bribes paid to a county assessor named Dale Furman. It named names. It named dates. It named the man running the operation, Victor Hale, Ridgeline's head of operations. The final entry was dated 1 week before the fire. Ed knew they were coming. He wrote it down, and then he burned. Carl understood exactly what he had purchased. Not just land, evidence. The question was, how long before they found out? 2 days later, a county sheriff's deputy rolled up the mountain road unannounced. His uniform was crisp, his smile was cold, and his questions were far too specific. He asked about the cellar. He asked what Carl had found while clearing debris. He asked if Carl had come across any old paperwork that might belong to the county. Carl kept his answers short, but the deputy's eyes swept the property like a man looking for something he already expected to find. That night, after the cruiser disappeared down the mountain, Carl checked his truck out of habit. What he found made his blood run cold. The brake line had been scored with a blade, not severed, just nicked. A slow leak. The kind designed to fail on a steep mountain road, miles from help, where an accident would look like just another tragedy on treacherous terrain. A message. Carl fixed the line and didn't sleep. At this point, would you have stayed or taken the evidence and run? Let me know in the comments. 3 days later, a black SUV climbed the trail and parked in front of the homestead. The man who stepped out was tall, silver-haired, and dressed like money. He introduced himself as Victor Hale, Senior Vice President of Ridgeline Resources. His handshake was firm. His smile never reached his eyes. Hale didn't waste time. He offered $100,000 cash for Carl to sign over the deed and disappear. No lawyers, no questions, just walk away. Carl refused. Hale's voice dropped. This land has a history of accidents, Mr. Novak. Fires, falls, equipment failures. It would be a shame if that pattern continued. Carl said nothing. Hale climbed back into his SUV and drove away. But that night, Ash alerted to the tree line. And Carl spotted a figure with binoculars on the ridge. They were watching him now. Carl knew exactly what he was up against. A corporation with deep pockets, a bought sheriff, a corrupt county assessor, and enough resources to make one veteran disappear on a mountain no one else would touch. He couldn't outgun them, but 22 years in the army had taught him something more valuable than firepower: how to plan for the worst and make sure the enemy loses even if you don't survive. He had 48 hours, maybe less. Carl created 3 separate insurance policies, each one capable of destroying Ridgeline if anything happened to him. One buried in a waterproof container 200 yards from the homestead. One mailed to a P.O. box in Durango under a name they'd never trace. And the originals? Hand-delivered through a dead drop at the VA hospital in Denver to an investigative journalist named Sarah Cleary. She had a reputation for taking on corporate corruption, and she owed a favor to a mutual friend. Then Carl set the failsafe. If he didn't check in with Cleary by 8 a.m. Mountain Time every single day, she would publish everything and contact the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. He also left a sealed envelope with a veterans advocacy group, a backup in case Cleary was ever compromised. Now I want to ask you, what would your fail-safe plan be? Could you outthink a corporation trying to silence you? Carl went back to the homestead, checked his rifle, and waited. He didn't have to wait long. They came on a frozen Thursday night. The mountain roads were sheets of ice. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away. The kind of night where a man could disappear and no one would find him until spring thaw. Carl was in the half-rebuilt cabin when Ash's head snapped up, ears forward, body rigid. A low, rumbling growl rose from deep in his chest, the sound he only made when he detected hostile movement. Carl killed the lantern and moved to the window. 3 figures, spread out, approaching from different angles. They moved like men who knew what they were doing. One carried something that glinted in the moonlight. This wasn't intimidation anymore. This was elimination. What followed was the longest night of Carl's life since Helmand Province. He slipped out the back with Ash and used the terrain he'd spent weeks memorizing. The frozen ground, the rock outcroppings, the tree line. Every feature became cover or concealment. He moved, stopped, listened, moved again. Ash stayed close, silent, tracking scent and sound that Carl couldn't perceive. One of the attackers made the mistake of approaching a woodpile where Carl had positioned himself. He never saw Ash coming. 70 pounds of muscle and military training hit him from the blind side, driving him into the frozen ground before he could raise his weapon. Carl was on him a second later. By the time the sky began to lighten, one attacker was unconscious and zip-tied to a pine tree. A second had fled down the mountain after Ash cornered him against a ravine. The third sat in the snow with a dislocated shoulder and a look of pure hatred. Carl didn't have to make a call. His failsafe had already triggered, and help was coming. Sarah Cleary published the story in the Denver Post 46 hours later. Ed Womack's journal, the falsified surveys, the bribery payments, the core samples proving lithium deposits worth hundreds of millions. All of it made the front page. And once the story broke, it couldn't be buried again. Federal investigators from the FBI's Public Corruption Task Force arrived in San Juan County before the week was out. The indictments came down within 90 days. Victor Hale was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, bribery of public officials, and fraud. Dale Furman, the county assessor who had helped squeeze Ed Womack off his own land, was charged with accepting bribes, falsifying public records, and obstruction of justice. The deputy who scored Carl's brake line turned state's witness to avoid federal prison. Ridgeline Resources, facing shareholder lawsuits and regulatory collapse, sent their lawyers to Carl with a 7-figure settlement offer and a non-disclosure agreement. He refused. Instead, Carl rebuilt Ed Womack's homestead with his own hands. He reinforced the foundation, replaced the roof, and restored the root cellar where Ed's truth had waited 7 years to be found. Near the cellar entrance, he placed a simple granite marker engraved with Ed's name and 5 words. The truth outlasts the fire. 6 months later, The land opened as a retreat for combat veterans. Silence, space, and time to heal. Ash, gray around the muzzle now, watched them arrive from the porch. He still positioned himself between Carl and any stranger who approached, but his eyes were softer. He slept more deeply than he had in years. His war was finally over. What hit you hardest? Carl refusing the settlement, or Ash finally getting to rest? Let me know in the comments.